Well, today we start 2 Timothy, and I'm quite excited. We did 1 Timothy earlier this year, and so we're going to do 2 Timothy before Christmas. And the two books, although one's called 1 Timothy and the one called 2 Timothy, they're not really well connected together, except for the point that they came from Paul and they went to Timothy. So we're going to look at the differences, because the differences are actually quite striking. And I have this picture up here because the atmosphere of 2 Timothy is in the midst of great anger and antagonism in the world at the time that 2 Timothy was written. And I'll explain that a little bit. This book is actually called, if you look at it in Greek, pros Timotheon. So pros means to, and Timotheon means Timothy. So it's to Timothy. Oh, see, you read Greek. Here you go. But to separate the two books, later scribes, as they were carrying forward the copies of these books, decided they would, you need to distinguish them. You can't call them both pros Timotheon. So they put an A on the first one, and then they put a B on the second one. So this is pros Timotheon part B is what it is. So that's what they would look at. I don't like that letter. We're going to replace it in a second. But this is Paul's second letter to Timothy. And really, this is, when you understand that these aren't necessarily theological treatises, they're just meant to be, they're just letters. They're letters between Paul and to Timothy. In the middle, it's full of theology, and that's why we read them. But they're really a personal letter between the two. And after Timothy received them, evidently they got copied and put in circulation, and we have copies to this day, and that's how we got this. So it's not a personal letter that was never meant to be public, but it is public today. Let me get the background, because what happens is between 1st and 2nd Timothy, a gigantic thing happens. 1st Timothy is written when Paul is in Rome, probably just before 60 or 62 AD. And this timeline I'm going to show you is somewhat speculative. We don't really know what happens, but this is because it's at the end of the book of Acts, and Paul, it comes out of Rome, the prison in Rome. Actually, it was more like house arrest. You know those ankle bracelet things? If they had ankle bracelets, that's what he would have had during his first stay in Rome. He had to actually provide his own apartment and his own food and everything he needed. He was just under house arrest. He couldn't leave. And so there was a soldier that was there that wouldn't let him leave. But I mean, in terms of accommodations, pretty nice, which is why whoever was in jail in that sense had to have their friends and relatives bring them food, because the jail was not going to provide it. So, but it was relatively comfortable. And we know that Paul had a lot of visitors coming in and going out during that first stay in Rome. And during that first stay in Rome, under the ankle bracelet house arrest, that's when he wrote 1 Timothy. So around 62-ish, we'll say, in Rome. But then we think that he had a fourth missionary journey, and this is the speculative part right here. Somewhere around 62 to 64, he ended up in Spain. There's actually extra biblical accounts that support that idea. He was in Spain probably immediately after that. And you remember Paul talked about wanting to go to Spain in some of his letters. So probably in Spain around 62 to 64. And then we know through extra biblical accounts that he made it all the way over to Crete, which is way over there on the right. Maybe, again, speculatively 64 to 65. After that, we know that he shows up in Miletus, which is on the coast of western Turkey today, and then goes inland from there and visits Colossae around 66. Again, the dates are plus or minus, I don't know, a year or two. We're not really sure, but we're pretty sure he makes this trip, maybe in this order. After that, he comes back to the coast of western Turkey to Ephesus, very famous place, which is where Timothy is right now receiving the letter, as he was the first time from the first letter, maybe around 66. And then Paul heads up to the top of the Aegean Sea, up to Philippi, where you get the letter to the Philippians. Woo! The Philippians. Yeah, Philippians. So he goes up to Philippi around 66. Then he crosses over the Macedonia Greek peninsula, goes over to Nicopolis over there, maybe 66, 67, and then back finally to Rome again. And Rome, this second time, is where he's writing 2 Timothy from. So we have another similarity. Not only is 1 and 2 Timothy from Paul to Timothy, but it's also from Rome, where Paul is, to Ephesus, where Timothy is. But 10 years apart, roughly, maybe even more. So, 10 years, 5 years, I overspoke that. So that's where they are right now. And then somewhere in Rome, Paul is put to death, somewhere 67, 68. And how do we know that? Well, because one of the Roman historians wrote about Paul and said he was killed during the term of Nero's Caesar. And Nero himself dies around 68. Nero's a kind of a weird guy. He gets a bad rep, and rightly so, but he ends up taking his own life in 68 because he loses the popular support of the Senate and the people in Rome, and he's out of town at the time. He just decides to kill himself. So that's it. So we know that Paul probably died somewhere around 67, 68. Well, that's likely what happened since 1 Timothy. Now we're in 2 Timothy before Paul dies. But there's a gigantic change in the Roman Empire. A gigantic change. Now, it's during the term of Nero. So what changes? Well, right around here in this time frame, somewhere around 64, a huge thing happens that affects the Christian community that's growing in the Mediterranean region. Huge thing. Huge thing. And that huge thing that happens in the Roman Empire comes back again to Nero. Why? Because, well, Nero now has been in power for 10 years by 64. He went in 54 when he was 16 years old. So 64, he's still Caesar, kind of split in terms of a populist, politically speaking, in the country. But in 64, while he's out of the country for a little while, Rome burns. Rome burns. I mean, he's out of town at the time. This fire goes for nearly a straight week. They're trying to put it out. And it spreads all through Rome during this entire week, 6-7 days long. They think they've got the fire out after nearly a week. And everyone says, yay, we're saved. And then it starts up again and burns for another 3 or 4 days. In the end, it devastates Rome. My memory serves me, there's 14 or 15 districts of Rome. Only 4 of them were spared being afflicted by the fire. So like 2/3 of Rome goes. And so someone has to be blamed for all this stuff. And so Nero decides, because of the way the popular opinion is going at the time, let's blame the Christians. They hate us so much. They've infiltrated so much of Rome. Let's blame the Christians. This is according to historian Tacitus. Let's blame the Christians. And then suddenly public sentiment against the Christians goes to a groundswell. And it's marked as the beginning of brutal, brutal persecution towards Christians. I mean brutal. So much so that it's recorded that historically Nero would have parties next to his place. And he would light these parties with torches that were Christians bound up in burnable materials and oil, and they would be lit to light the night activities, and they would use Christians as large candles. That again, that's according to history. That's the written down extra biblical history. So that's how bad it is at the time. So again, here's the huge contrast then between 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. 1 Timothy, Paul is in a rented apartment, entertaining people coming in, even people of Caesar's household, talking about the gospel. It's relatively friendly. When you get to 2 Timothy and Paul's second stay in Rome, we're lighting Christians in the backyard of Caesar's palace. I mean, it's that bad. It's that bad. And the Christian community then has to go underground because the persecution gets just really grotesque. All fired up to, not being punful, but all fired up by the fire in Rome and Nero putting the blame on the Christian community. So it's a radically different time. So when Paul ends in jail in Rome the second time, it's brutal. I mean, now we're talking about what you think of when you think of like a dungeon jail. That's where Paul is now. And he's not making friends. It's really a horrible place. That's the change in atmosphere. So when you get to this, we realize that these are actually Paul's last words. He is going to be martyred shortly after he writes 2 Timothy. And he knows this. You'll see this in the way he writes. So these are his last words. So we can anticipate as we read 2 Timothy that these will be the most important things on Paul's mind for Timothy, because this is the last thing he writes. Now when we look at the letters that Paul writes chronologically, this really is the last letter. This is the end. All the stuff you've read about from Paul to Romans, the Corinthians, Colossians, Philippians, Thessalonians, all that stuff, this is the last. There's no more after this, because shortly after this he dies. So I'm going to redo that B, and I'm going to make it an omega instead, because the Greek alphabet goes alpha to omega. Alpha is the first letter. Omega is the last letter. Get it? Omega, last letter. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave it like that. It's because it's his last letter. It's not just part A and part B. This is part end. This is the last. So these are his last words. That changes a lot of what we read as we read this, because these will now be Paul's most precious advice and theological advice to Timothy, knowing that this is his last shot at saying all this kind of stuff. So let's just dive in. He starts off verse 1, Paul, an apostle of the Messiah Jesus, by the will of God, according to the promise of the life that is in the Messiah Jesus. And by the way, I put a note right there. I'm going to take the liberty to swap out the word Christ in English and put in the Messiah, because it's exactly the same thing. We end up when we see Christ thinking that's sort of Jesus' last name, and we don't really ascribe much meaning to it. But Christ in Greek, means the anointed one. It means exactly what Messiah means in Hebrew. So when we see Messiah in Hebrew, we're thinking the right things. He's the anointed, the promised one. Christ, we see him as the last name in the English church. I forget that. So I'm going to switch out every time I see Christ. If your version says Christ, that's okay. It's a great translation. But I'm going to put Messiah because it suddenly gets us in the right mindset. The promised one from all the life of the Jews, the King of Israel, also the King of all mankind. So that's Messiah. So Paul says, I'm an apostle. By the way, an apostle doesn't mean a high-placed leader in the organization of the administrative church. Just saying. Apostle in Greek, the apo means far, and the stol part means by arrangement. So by arrangement, he's meant to be a far guy. The best translation in our English vernacular is missionary, because a missionary goes places. You wouldn't be a missionary if you stayed home. It's a sent person. So an apostle is a sent person who's by arrangement sent to be somewhere else, to be away. So that's what Paul is. He's sent to be away. Now you say, what about the other, the apostles of Jesus? Were they sent to be away? Yes, they were. So again, whenever you see the word apostle used, you need to be exacting in its meaning. Its meaning means someone who is deliberately meant to be sent away, basically to carry the message to a place where it's not. The apostles were all like that. They were sent away ones. When an apostle stays in your midst and doesn't go anywhere, it makes me question the original meaning of the word. Apostle always meant someone who's sent away. So of the Messiah Jesus, by Paul's an apostle, by the will of God, not his plan. And by the way, when you read the Damascus Road account, it was not Paul's plan to be an apostle of Jesus. It was his plan to destroy Jesus, and everyone followed him. So I just love this, because he says, I'm an apostle, but that was God's plan, not mine. I'm glad to be here, but it's by his will. It's by his will that this is the case, according to the promise of the life that is in the Messiah Jesus. So Paul is called by God to be an away guy to talk about this because of the promise of life that's in the Messiah Jesus, because of the promise of life. So Paul's not called to be an apostle, to go out there and say, I told you so, and be a scold, to tell them to stop sinning. Paul is called to be an apostle, to talk in the away places about life in Jesus. That's what it's all about. So anyway, that's what he's talking about. That's his opening line. All of his letters start this way. This is how we know that Paul's the one who wrote the letter. Oh, okay. To Timothy, my beloved child. Now, is Timothy his literal child? How do you know? Well, probably not. Probably not. We do know that Timothy came to the Lord through Paul's work. So likely what we're talking about is a child, spiritually speaking. He came to the Lord through him. So to Timothy, my beloved child, but he treats him kind of like his own son as a result. He says, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and the Messiah, Lord Jesus. Messiah Jesus our Lord. And I don't want you to throw away those words. Paul uses those a lot when he opens stuff. They are such great words. So just to remind us how great these words are, every time I see these three words, for me, I place another word in my head to help me remember what it's all about. So for the word grace, I always think about a gift that's given. If you just want to use the word gift, it's actually a great translation for grace. Because grace is something that you receive that you didn't earn. That's what a gift is. If you had a birthday party, would you try and pay back all the people who brought gifts? No, in fact, that would be highly disrespectful of the people who gave it. They gave the gift freely, that not that you're supposed to earn it or pay them back. They gave it because they gave it freely. That's grace. Grace is everything in life that you have from God that you don't deserve, that he doesn't expect you to pay back. And if you try and pay him back, he will be offended. And by the way, most Most false religions who try and be near Christian usually will take the word grace and they'll redefine it. Because the entire idea that you get something great from God that you don't have to work for or earn or pay back seems wrong in their thinking. But biblically speaking, it's a free gift. It's a free gift. That's the hallmark of what God's intention is for you. So there's grace. What about mercy? Well, for me, I think about this with mercy. Clicker work. It's condemnation that's withheld. So the first one is good stuff that you don't deserve. The second one is things that are withheld that you do deserve, which is condemnation from God. It's this independent, rebellious, sinful life. Here, God makes you as the creator. He makes you. He gives you breath. He gives you life. He gives you all these things that you did not make for yourself. You live this life and you stiff-arm God and say, I want nothing to do with you. And he says, man, that's just super bad because you're completely disrespecting the one who so freely gave you life. So condemnation comes from that. Probably one of the most striking parables Jesus ever talks about is the one where he has this vineyard. Remember this vineyard that this guy owns? And he makes this vineyard and he brings these guys in to run the vineyard because the owner's going to go away. And he says, when I go away, you can run the vineyard. All I ask is my 10%. That was the standard payment for tenant farming at the time. I just want my 10%. But hey, run the farm, pick the grapes, make your wine, do everything. But and so when he comes to collect his 10%, remember what they do? They say no, and they kill the people who come to collect. This happens a couple times till finally the owner says, I'll send my son. They'll respect him. They don't respect the son. They kill him thinking if we kill the son, we will inherit the vineyard that he would have inherited. It's ours permanently. Well, when you step back and you look at that tale, which to them during their time, they knew what that tale, that was an atrocious, horrible thing. They understood that this whole picture is God who owns the vineyard of earth, and we are just tenant farmers here. And so for us to sit there and act like there is no God and yet to benefit from all that God gives us is an extraordinary affront to the Creator himself. That's why condemnation is due. That's why condemnation is due. A fool says in his heart there is no God. So that's the beginning of all that stuff. So there is condemnation. Mercy, that condemnation has been withheld because of what Christ has done for you. So wow. So number one, grace, all the things I enjoy from God that I couldn't earn and I won't pay back and he wants to give me and he's delighted in giving me. Number two, the condemnation which I do deserve, he has withheld because of what Christ has done on my behalf. Whoa, we could stop right there. But then there's peace. And now we get the wrong idea with peace. So again, we have to come back and realize I have to apologize as being part of the baby boomer generation who went through the 60s and defined peace. Kind of half zoned out, peace. That's not peace that we're talking about right here. It's not even close to what we're talking about here. It's not an absence of consciousness. It's something much different. In fact, what it is, we don't normally think about much today. It's the opposite of war. This word is the opposite of war. So when there's warring factions during their time in ancient time, very common. There's lots of wars going on all over the place. Very common. So that when the wars stopped, you said, we finally at peace. Now, there's another idea that comes from this lack of warfare is the fact that when you're warring with someone, there's a distance between you and them. And so this idea of peace is not only the stopping of hostilities, but it's the fact that the two warring factions now have nothing separate them and they can come together again. So for instance, the warring factions we had during World War II, all those distances that we had culturally between all the people who were warring have all been they've been closed. Those gaps are not there anymore. It's an astonishing thing in just one generation. This is what this word peace in the New Testament means. It's actually nearness by ceasefire. It's nearness by ceasefire. So because there's been a ceasefire, because the war has ended, it gets you to part B, which is nearness with the one you were fighting with. Well, so who was at war? We were. Remember the story of the vineyard? When the owner sent his guys there to collect his 10%, what did they do? They went to war with the messengers. They were at war with the owner. They were at war with the owner's son. They were at war. They wanted what God had left them with, and they did not want to acknowledge God owned it. So they were at war with the owner. Well, that's the position of mankind. We're at war with the owner of this place. That's just it. So now that you've come through Christ, to understand the abundant life that he brings, grace, also the fact that condemnation has stopped because of what he's done, and also the fact that now, because the wars have ceased, now there's an opportunity for you and God to be near. That's what that peace is. That's peace. Now, peace in this case is the cessation of hostilities, but more than that, it's the drawing near because of the cessation of hostilities. So that's peace. In those three words, it basically defines where we've come from and where we've gone to because of Christ. They're just great three words. Grace, mercy, and peace. And by the way, where'd they come from? God himself. We didn't earn it. We didn't create it. God himself. From God the Father and our Messiah Jesus, our Lord. By the way, our Lord, that word Lord in Greek is this word kurios, which means boss. Literally means boss. The guy in charge. The highest authority. Kurios. If you went to a village in the first century and you wanted to find out who's in charge, you'd ask for the kurios. Who's in charge of this village? The guy in charge. Well, when we talk about Jesus as being the kurios, he's in charge of everything. That's the kurios. That's what's being used there. So people who try and split apart God the Father and Messiah Jesus in a non-Trinitarian way lose the fact that how can you call Jesus as being the kurios of everything if God himself is the creator of everything? Well, because Jesus is the creator of everything. Well, then what role does that leave for God? No, that is God. You see, so this is how this sort of blurs into the Trinitarian idea. There really is one God. Multiple persons, but one God. Okay, so that's how he opens. And just to give you an overview of what's going to happen after this, that's his standard open. 2 Timothy is split pretty much in half. First two chapters, second two chapters. And not topically so much, but in the fact of time. The first two chapters, Paul will dwell on present issues. He'll recall things that have happened in the life of Timothy and Paul and how things are right now. And then he'll switch, as you would, writing your last letter to someone about anticipating the future. And he'll do that in the last two chapters. So that's an easy way to remember what's going on. So we're going to jump right into the first context, which is the present. And that's what he's going to hit on right here. So here we go, verse 3. So I thank God whom I serve. As did my ancestors with a clear conscience. I thank God whom I serve, as did who are his ancestors? The Jews, yeah. And particularly some Jews more than others. Actually, Paul now is in prison in Rome, but he's also in prison with the enthusiastic support of his Jewish critics as well. Because of what Rome did in terms of persecuting the Jews, it made it easy for his Jewish critics to say, yes, Rome, put him in jail. We like this action. This is great. So it made that entire thing easy for him. So are those his ancestors? In a sense, not really. His ancestors from a Jewish perspective, and we're talking Jewish, are the people who, like him, spoke the truth in the midst of persecution. People like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea, all these guys, the prophets for sure, all these folks who basically went on record as saying, oh, Israel, watch out. God loves you, but you're also in the red zone with his will. You got to be careful. So that's what Paul's been doing here as well. So he's saying, I've been conscientious about this. Just like my ancestors I'm serving, and I'm doing with a clear conscience. I'm doing this exactly right. This is what God's called me to do, and I thank God because I'm serving him. And I do this as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. Of course, he's in prison. Not a lot to do. But he remembers Timothy night and day in his prayers. And that's really a pretty cool deal. That's convicting to me, because when I think about who do I pray for night and day in my prayers, not many people. But for Paul, as Paul looks forward in the midst of this persecution, which will likely end in his martyrdom, He's looking at Timothy and he's saying, God, thank you for Timothy. Thanks for getting Timothy in place. Thank you that you've given him your spirit and your word. He's going to carry on this thing that's going on this man. I'm going to continue to pray for him night and day, especially since persecution makes these prayers even that much more important. So I pray for him night and day. That's how he carries on his service to God while he's in prison right here. And he says, as I remember your tears, I long to see you that I may be blank. Oh, it's quiz time. Oh, they're sneaking a look in their Bibles. Okay, if I was going to complete this sentence, as I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be an encouragement to you. I long to see you because I want to be an encouragement to you. Or, I long to see you because I miss your eyes. No, that doesn't sound right. I long to see you because, I mean, there's 1,000 reasons, humanly speaking, why I'd long to see you. But you know what he says? I think this is just really something. So that I may be filled with joy. Well, that's not so odd, really. I mean, a lot of people that I love to see, that I say, I long to see you, I really want to see you. I know that when we get together, we will be filled with joy. I'll be filled with joy when I see him. And for Paul, that's definitely the case with Timothy. Timothy is the most mentioned other name in Paul's letters. So Paul and Timothy were tight. So for Paul to be in a jail over in Rome and for Timothy to be in Ephesus across the waters, Paul's just saying, I would just love to see you again. My joy would be full if I could just see you again. We recently had 2 of our kids in town, or 2 daughters of ours, who were just passing through from Georgia to Alaska. Man, that's a pass through. But it was a delight to see. It was a joy to see him. It's just a total joy to see him. And even with Timothy, who has been in tears, speaking to the difficulty of what he's trying to do. The post he's got in Ephesus, one of the most spiritually corrupt places in the universe. Ephesus, Temple of Diana, one of the wonders of the world. Just a grotesque place. By the way, Temple of Diana had quite a host of temple prostitutes that would roam around at night. I mean, when you read about the history, the spiritual history of Ephesus, it's just grotesque. So there's poor Timothy right in the middle of that. You know, if you're tempted to cry because of circumstances, that's a pretty good one to cry in. So Paul's saying, I remember your tears. I long to see you that I may be filled with joy. Really touching, really touching. And this might be Paul's request in a way, since he knows he's close to martyrdom, to say, man, I would just love to see you one last time. People that you lose, that you say, I would have loved to see him one more time. Paul knows he's right on the edge of that. He's right on the edge of that. Paul and Timothy had a tremendously warm relationship. Timothy wasn't just his servant or his accolade or something. He wasn't just a slave of Paul, an underling of Paul. Paul and Timothy loved each other, even though they're a generation apart, that I might be filled with joy. So I'm reminded of your sincere faith. A faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. And now, I'm sure, dwells in you as well. Oh. See, he's in the present. He's talking to him. As I think about you, as I'd love to see you, as what an encouragement it would be, what a joy it would be, I'm reminded of the fact of this faith that dwells in you. This faith. Same faith that I saw in your grandmother and in your mother. And I think now probably is in you, this faith. So now we got to stop. We'll stop the truck for a second and we'll talk about faith. Because again, it's one of those words that we misunderstand so many times. I was at a youth camp this summer and I spoke for the entire week on what faith is. It's just so poorly understood. Here it is. Hebrews 11, this is what we quote a lot. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, for by it the people of old received their commendation. Commendation actually means witness, but it's their witness to God, not their own witness to other people. It's the way in which God looked at them and said, yep, you're my witness. Faith is something that assures you about what you can't see. It's something that assures you about what you can't see. Okay? And that's actually the key to this entire thing. I use my own translation. I say faith it's a fully informed expectation of what cannot be seen based upon a knowledge in the character of God. So again, faith as a word does not work well unless it has a preposition to an object. Faith in God. or faith in my neighbor, or faith in my children, or faith in... Faith is a statement of an expectation that will happen that someone else will carry out because I know the somebody else. See, that's what's really, because I know the somebody else really well. Again, the issue that I always use is, faith in someone. I ask someone, say some 16-year-old, will you come to our house and feed our cat? Did you feed our cat? No. Okay, yeah, okay. So you ask them to come and feed your cat, and you leave town confident, with a confident expectation, a fully informed, confident expectation that the cat will indeed be fed in the future, something I cannot see, but I know will happen because I know the character of the one who said he'd do it. That's faith. It gives me an assurance of something I cannot see, but it's based on the character of the person. In the same way, if God promises you abundant life, I have faith in God that his promises will happen because I know God is true to his promises. Faith in the faithfulness of God to do what he said. Again, everything at the end of life as well. When you look at the Hebrews 11 passage I quoted on the right there, he starts off that whole chapter to let you know that all these heroes in the Old Testament who lived miserable lives, a.k.a. Isaiah and some of those guys. Isaiah, by legend, was sawn in two inside a log. What a great way to go. But why would these people persist serving God if they knew their end was so miserable? Because they had faith that God's promises of life were still to come. Why? Because God's always good to his word. So I have faith in God. Faith is an assurance of something you can't see, either because it's distant in time or in realms. That's what faith is. But by the way, faith is not blind faith. The secular definition of faith is believing something even though you know it's not true. And that's not true. Biblically speaking, faith is well informed. Based on what? Based on the character of God, based on the promises he makes. So that's a vastly different thing. So Paul is saying to Timothy right here, I'm reminding of this basically spiritual assurance, this expectation, which dwelt also in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure dwells in you as well. Now, because, like I said in Hebrews 11, this is an explanation for why people can put up with a crappy life, with a junky life, with a horrible end of life. Why would you put up with that kind of a life? Unless the best is yet to come. Promises of God. Abundant life. That's the point in Hebrews 11. And I think that's the point he's starting to bring up with Timothy. I know your tears. I know the difficulties you're having. I know all that kind of stuff. But faith gives us an assurance that the best is yet to be, based on the promises of God. That this is not the end. So what if you do end up being sawn in half inside a log, like I said? So what? So what? This is not the end. The best is yet to be. So that's what he's starting to bring up with Timothy. I understand your circumstances. If he could read Hebrews 11 to him, he'd read him Hebrews 11 because that's exactly what Hebrews 11 is about. Don't be bummed out by your circumstances because the best is yet to be. Yeah, according to who? According to God. Well, according to what did God say? According to his promises to me. So you just have to take him to the bank on that. So I'm sure that dwells in you. So he's actually approaching this idea of how he's depending on God. So he says in verse 6, for this reason, the reason about Timothy's faith, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Fan the flame of the gift of God. Did you realize that you could have a gift from God inside of you that's dormant? That needs to be fanned into flame? He's using a metaphor that's really common to them. It's not common to us unless you make campfires every day. But I mean, if you come upon a campfire that looks kind of like this, it's a loser. But in the ancient times, if you went to bed at night and you left the fire burning and it stayed overnight and all the coals get kind of ashen and gray, and you look at it in the morning and say, man, that sucker is dead. Well, it's not dead. if you take a stick and you stir it around a little bit, there's hot coals in the bottom of it. And so what do? You put a little kindling on it and you fan it into flame. This is the metaphor he's using. There's something in you, Paul's saying, this faith that's in you, that's like a hot coal that's inside it. We need to have that fanned into flame. We need to take it out of this dormant phase and have it just burst into flame. You need to burst into flame in Ephesus. No more of these smoldering coals. We need to blow it in. So it's a careful process. I really like the picture because many times if you do this, you can actually take some coals, put some tinder under your hand, take a small coal on top of it, and you actually, and you blow it until this thing in your hand bursts. I like this because this is sort of what he's saying. You need to fan this sucker into flames, this thing that God's put inside you. And before we get off of that, I do find it fascinating that there is a possibility based on this, that there's something inside of you that's a hot coal that has not been fanned into flame yet. And Timothy was pretty far along in his ministry with Paul. And Paul's still saying, but buddy, there is more to come. We need to have God and the Spirit and me and you. We need to blow this thing into a fire. Because what we need in Ephesus isn't a little coal. We need a fire. We need a fire there. So what he's asking him to do is fan it into flame. So it actually looks more like this. Okay, because that is exactly what Paul is saying. You need to be in that part of Asia Minor in Ephesus. You need to be a blazing fire. And I think there's something inside you that needs to be fanned into flame. As I look back on my life and I think about the changes that have happened to me that God has done over decades, I was content to be what I had thought I was way back there. Which was, by the way, an engineer. Hey, Mac. Right? To be an engineer. Because I found, okay. Are there more engineers there? I don't know. There's my... Anyway, that was my concept, my fullest concept of who I was inside. There were no other coals that needed to be fanned into flame. None. And I've told the story before, but in my confrontation with God, for me, kind of a minor version of the Damascus Road experience, but with my real confrontation with God, he said, that's coming to an end. And I argued with God. And I said, no, that's exactly who I am. I'm very successful at it. I'm being paid too much money to do it. And by the way, I love every second of it. I'm in my stride. I just love everything about this. And at the end of that confrontation, which is actually a one-sided monologue from my part, God was being very silent. At the end of that conversation, I told God, this is who I am. And God said, literally, you haven't got a clue who you are. So there was something more in a coal that was dormant there than I understood. Now I had inklings about that. I'd done stuff at church on and off, but I really had no real inkling about that. In a way, God was saying to me, it's time for us to fan the flame of that thing. And that's why I'm here. That's why I do what I do now, because that was fanned into flame. So it's an interesting thing. There may be still parts of who I am and who you are that have still not been fanned into flame yet. So I'm open to that opportunity. If God says, if I say to God, well, God, this is just who I am now, and this is perfect, and I'm suited to this, and I think that's all there is. That's me, boy. That's totally me now. There's nothing else. I expect God to walk into the room again and say, still haven't got a clue who you are. And that's another piece, but I place in you more than you understand. I used to have this conversation all the time with high schoolers who, when I was doing youth ministry, are eager, like I was when I was in high school, to sort of figure out who I am so I can chart a path that's clear that starts from point A and goes to point B and goes to point C, make my path. There's a lot of anxiety about that, and I understand that, and I went through that as well. I understand that. But I would plead with them and say, look, there's so much about who you are inside that you haven't got a clue about yet. You really don't. And that's the exciting prospect. The best thing you can do is go to God and say, God, I don't know what I am or who I am, but you made me, so I need you to kind of chart a path for me because I'm not sure. I got some inklings. Here's my ideas. I like to do this. I don't know. And in that kind of yielded, lack of willfulness, when you go to God and say, God, take me to where you want me to go, God says, I've been waiting for you to say that. We can do this. So that's what God does. He fans us into flame in areas we probably don't even have an inkling about. See, he says, look, God gave us a spirit not of fear, but he gave us a spirit of power and love and self-control. And this is where we're going to end today, because this is the contrast of this coal that needs to be fanned into flame. He's saying, look, this coal that's inside of you needs to be fanned into flame. But I get this idea, this suspicion, Paul's saying, that it's not been blown into flame because fear has kind of put it out. Fear is not allowing the oxygen to get in to actually fan into flame. So he's saying, look, God has not given us a spirit that's fearful. That is something that does not blow those things into flame. He's given us a spirit that's totally opposite to that. And again, you can see in this timidity of Timothy, which we saw in 1 Timothy come out. Paul's saying this timidity that's slowing you down, that's not getting you engaged, all that kind of stuff. You know, I think about Top Gun when I think about don't want to get engaged. It's not good stuff. You make all those excuses about why, even though there's something you could do, you say, well, I just can't. No. There's like an overriding fear. You don't have a spirit that God has given you that's about fear. You've been given something much more than that. So this is kind of his way of saying this is how this ember that's inside you is going to be fanned into flame, because realize who the spirit is he's given you. The spirit he's given you is not sheltering that coal. He's blowing it into fire. So let's look at the words he says. Not a spirit of fear, power, love, and self-control. Interesting group of things. So we'll spend a little time looking at these before we finish. Power, love, self-control. Power, good translation. Because in Greek, that word looks in Greek like dynamite. It's dynamos. I mean, it looks like dynamite. D-Y, it looks like dynamite. It's power. That's why dynamite was named dynamite, because it's from this Greek word for power. So power, okay, wait a second. Why is this important? Well, someone whose coal is being sort of artificially protected because of fears of ministry, you don't have a real sense that there's power in what you're doing, or that there's power inside you to do what you need to do. Many times, in fact, when you're in ministry, especially a confrontive, hard situation, which is what Rome has become now, the fear tends to make you back off and say, well, I'll just keep my little coal for today because they look really angry and powerful and I'm not. You see how it kind of makes you timid because you have a false understanding of where the power is? Instead, in those confrontations, you need to say to yourself, even though my heart is being fearful right now and doubtful about my own abilities, but wait a second, God has given me a spirit that's dynamite. What am I doing withdrawing? I need to stay in here. This is powerful. This is powerful. And when you look at the history of Paul and the other apostles, even Timothy himself, as they wandered around the areas, they didn't do anything really remarkable. They brought the truth, and in the truth, coupled with the power of the Spirit, people came to Jesus. Against all odds, people came to Jesus. Can you believe it? They'd walk into town, they'd talk about who Jesus is, and boom, and then they become followers. How is that possible? Paul says, it's not because I had fancy words. I didn't. I talked about the cross. There's power here that we're not seeing that's invisible. Well, it's the power of the Spirit inside them. That's what it is. So in fearful situations, we often withdraw. Now, I can really relate to this because I've had some gigantically confrontational meetings with people in public in nasty situations. And your first impulse is to go, okay, never mind. I didn't really say that. Okay, bye. Have a good day, right? There's something inside you that wants to avoid that conflict. And we're talking about spiritual issues which could save their life and bring abundant living. But because of the offense and because of the apparent power of the onslaught, you are tempted to withdraw. Instead, we need to say, there's a spirit inside of me, and that spirit is powerful. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to let the Spirit work through me right now. I'm not going to obey the timidity of the fear in my flesh. I'm just going to stay right here. And that's what I've done in some cases, and in others I withdrew because people came on so strong. So strong. I just felt completely inadequate. And I think that's happening in Timothy. So Paul's saying, remember, in the midst of that, the Spirit that God has given you is dynamite. What are you doing running away? What are you doing just looking at the coal inside you? Let's blow that sucker into a fire. Dynamite. And then he says, and I think this is fascinating, this word love, it's the word you know, agape. And agape love is primarily an act of the will to commit yourself to the best for another person. That's what love is. And so again, when you're in a confrontive situation where someone's talking down to you or they're challenging the gospel or saying stupid things, but that's like really, really combative, one of my first impulses is to hit them. Well, not physically, but figuratively hit them. You know, I feel like I'm suddenly in a war, so I turn on the defenses and I want to go to war too. And Jesus says when it comes to your enemies, you need to love them. Oh, no. Well, here's the idea. When you're in this confrontive situation with someone, Paul says, don't turn into their enemy. Remember that the spirit inside you is a spirit that is committed to their good, loves them. And you need to get in line behind that. I know there's so few times, and I went through a catalog of these confrontations I've had, there are so few times, where my immediate attitude was to say, okay, they're attacking me, but I need to stay engaged for their good, to love them. And when I would get to that point, I'd be praying and I'd say, God, your spirit's in me. I don't know how I'm supposed to love them, but I need to love them. My flesh wants to smack them around a little bit because they've been smacking me around. I want to return what I'm getting, and I know that's wrong. But God, I want to stay engaged in this so that they understand that you are for their best, and I want to be for their best. Man, that is so unnatural. It is so unnatural. And yet that's how the followers of Jesus are pinpointed in the confrontations of life. These people brought me truth, and when I smacked them around, they continued to love me, and they continued to bring me back to this would be so great for you. I don't get that. They should have hated me. But this is their response. It's so unnatural. And this is exactly the response that Jesus had with people around him. You know, he said if they hit you on one cheek, give them the other cheek. Don't run away. Don't smack their cheek. You know, stay engaged because God loves them. The Spirit of God is in you and loves them. Stay engaged to love them and to work the conversation for their benefit. That's what you need to do. I think it's just brilliant. Power, the ability for God to do something in the moment. Love, the purposes is their reconciliation with God and their ultimate abundant life. And self-control. Okay, have you ever had one of these confrontations I'm talking about? You have this confrontation, and immediately upon the confrontation, there's a whirlwind, a tornado, a hurricane of emotions that come up inside you. I mean a storm of emotions. Some of them anger, some of them being, all that stuff. I mean, all that stuff just swirls up. And it swirls up so fast and in such volume that it completely obscures your ability to say anything that makes sense in the next second. Who says? Right? So it completely debilitates you. This is the opposite of that. This word means actually a sound, controlled mind that is not in a whirlwind of emotions. This is a reasoned response. Paul says you need a reasoned response when someone asks you. And this is exactly what he's talking about. When you look at the credentials for leadership in the early church that Paul talks about in Titus and Timothy, this word is used over and over again of those people. These are people who are not overwhelmed with emotional responses and confrontations. They're calm, cool, collected, rational. It's the same idea as when you write a will and you start off the will and it says, me in my right mind. This is the right mind part, is what this is. So this is so applicable again. When I think about confrontations, I pray, God, I need to be in my right mind right now rather than let my natural, fleshly, emotional reactions so cloud my thinking right now that I'm useless in this situation. I need to let God take those emotions, and I need God's Spirit, which is itself controlled in its sane mind in that sense, be the thing that drives my thinking and my speaking. It's so practical, so really practical. I won't relate. I was going through all these things I had. I'm not going to relate one to because I got one I'll show you in a little bit. But this is such a practical application of the fact that when you're in confrontations, especially when you're talking spiritual issues, remember that you are not powerless. The Spirit's inside you. This is a spirit of power. You're here for the purposes of their benefit, not for you to win an argument. And on top of that, the emotions that will swirl around in the midst of this confrontation need not be a distraction. The spirit God has given you is a spirit of a sound, controlled mind. And it's all unnatural. It's all from the Spirit. It's all from the Spirit. So here, as we quit here today, Paul's saying to Timothy, I know there's faith inside you. I saw it in your grandmother and your mother. I'm pretty sure it's inside you. Your faith, your expectation of what God's going to do now and in the future. I know that expectation you have is in God's character and who he is. I know that all is true. But I know that also the spirit he gave you is not a spirit that is cloaked in fear all the time. So if fear is what you're doing, then you're not relying on the Spirit, because here's what he's given you. He's given you a spirit that's powerful, a spirit that's looking for the best of other people, and a spirit that's actually rational. There are a lot of conversations I have more recently on the internet where someone will say some version of, you Christians are just crazy, which is a claim against that last line. I mean, you're not even thinking well. Your thinking is not disciplined. And what many times the next thing that comes up is disciplined thinking is scientific thinking. And so you're not thinking scientifically. Well, I deal with that all the time. And I tell them, well, but wait, my entire professional training is in science. So I think I'm thinking quite well. So what I have to do is I have to go back to say, you don't know much about the gospel. You don't know much about the theology I'm talking about. Because if you did, you would understand, speaking as a scientist, that it's sound. It's sound. What we're talking about in terms of our beliefs are sound. Even from a scientific definition of logic and soundness, it's sound. So what's not sound, just to clue you in on a little piece of science trivia, what's not really sound is quantum mechanics. Now, I'm not dissing quantum mechanics. I took a whole year of quantum mechanics because I needed to know how to design transistors and solid state theory and stuff like that, and it's very useful in some circumstances. But most physicists who deal with quantum physics and quantum mechanics all the time, when you get back to the roots of quantum mechanics, it's a little bit crazy. Things aren't exactly where they're supposed to be. And in the actual effort of you trying to see where they are, they go someplace else. I'm not kidding. That's one of the foundations of quantum physics. Now, there's usefulness to it. I'm not dissing it because there's something about that sort of rings true, but parts of it that are based on presumption and cult-like religion, in a sense. Okay? And I got to tell you, I made a living using quantum mechanics. I'm not totally dissing it. I'm just saying that at its fundamentals, it's not based on anything that's really hard. It's sort of squishy. And a lot of the edges of science and physics are kind of squishy, but science and people who don't know much about science will say that science is the only way to know truth. Well, there's a lot of squishies in the edges of science. There's a lot of hard rock in the middle of science. So that's kind of where you are. But the whole point here is that a lot of people will look at Christianity and beliefs and our theology and say, you're all squishy. There's no heart at all in you. I mean, there's nothing solid in what you're about. And I tell them, well, there's actually quite a lot that's very solid. Very solid. And it's rational. And the Spirit gives us the ability to communicate that soundness, this self-discipline, this non-emotional approach to explaining things. I mean, the Spirit can do that. It's actually sound. And that's what that last word, if you want a single word replacement for it, sound. Sound mind. It's sound. It's good. So God gave us not a spirit of fear, He gave us but of dynamite and best interests of other people and soundness. And that's what you need to engage when you have these hard conversations with people. And if you find in those conversations that you don't innately have those qualities, and you don't, you need to pray right on the spot. God, I know your Spirit's in me, and I know your Spirit is powerful, and I know your Spirit is aimed at the best of the person I'm talking to, and I know that your Spirit is going to bring information that's sound. I need you to take this conversation, because I can't do this. I've prayed that prayer a lot, and God answers that prayer. And Dorothy and I relate some of these conversations to one another, and when we're relating it, we use this phrase. I found myself saying, blah. in a sense, I don't think I came up with that, but I think that came from the Spirit. I found myself saying, and it had a profound change in the conversation. The Spirit can do that in you. But you gotta not run away because of fear. You gotta stay for the benefit of the person that's there. And you gotta understand that it's a sound message. Okay, we're gonna quit right there. I'm gonna give you a couple examples first, but this is pros Timotheon omega, Paul's last words, and he wants them to understand what's super important. In opposition, we find ourselves really needy of the things he's talking about right here, just as we've been pointing out. And I want to show you just two examples of opposition, which came to my desk this week. Not about me, but about other people. This one right here, I find just fascinating. Came from Jews for Jesus. It's a quarterly newsletter that I get from them. I have great admiration for Jews for Jesus. They do things in a very bold and opposed way. They're opposed a lot. This just came to me this week. David Brickner, who's the executive director, he writes this. He says, it was Friday afternoon. Our music team, the Liberated Wailing Wall, was being rudely escorted off the campus of Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Our concert had been canceled due to pressure and protests from the Jewish Student Association. Now we were being further impeded, forbidden even to hand out gospel tracts outside. As we were leaving, one protester shouted, "You think this is bad? Just wait until Market Theater later today." Well, the Market Theater is a well-known concert venue in downtown Johannesburg. I didn't take the threat lightly. Still, the extra security guards that we had to hire for the event were not prepared for what happened. Hundreds of protesters, formed a human chain outside the entrance of the theater, keeping most concert goers away from the theater. When the guards, the ones they hired, when the guards attempted to intervene, one of the leaders pulled a gun and aimed it at the head of our security and led the protesters as they forced their way into the auditorium. The riot police finally showed up and informed me that they didn't think it wise to try to drag the protesters out, so our attempts to start the concert were drowned out by the howls of the protesters, despite our louder sound equipment. Someone turned out the lights and people rushed the stage, pulling out microphone cords. At that point, the police strongly suggested we cancel the performance. It was our last before leaving South Africa. I announced with great regret that it seemed in South Africa free speech wasn't allowed, at least not to Jews who also believed in Jesus. The protesters cheered and triumphantly marched out of the theater, believing they had scored a victory, and frankly, that's how it seemed to us as well. Just imagine how my team and I felt. Wow. Here's another one. You know Earl Erskine, Bishop Earl. Earl's actually part of our ministry here as Ex-Mormon Files. And all he does is he interviews and listens to the stories of people who have come to Christ out of the LDS Church. They just tell their stories. Nothing's made up. They're just telling their stories. We did some just 2 days ago. And last week, they're really remarkable stories. Again, really great evidence to the dunamis, the power of the Spirit in these people's lives. I mean, just extraordinary. So, but because of where we live, this is not without opposition. So, this week on the telephone, we got this.
Hi, this message is for Earl Erskine. I'm just letting you know that you and your religion are a fake. Yeah, you and your fake 3-in-1 Jesus. You guys are not saved. You guys are not born again. The true religion was restored by Joseph Smith. You take down your fake videos off YouTube. You're liars and you're frauds.
We used to get those a lot, but not as much now. But it's still out there. So there is opposition to, and this is not being opposed to the theology that Earl's talking about. They're opposed to people telling their real stories of what happens in their life, what God does with them. I mean, that's just the stories of what happens in their life. But this guy apparently thinks that it's all made up. We had for years people claiming that the videos that we had done here like a decade back that had, quote, experts were interviewing in the videos, scientists back in the DNA versus the Book of Mormon days, claiming that these people that showed up weren't real scientists. They were actors we hired to say things. And so, remember that, Bob? It was just nuts. It was just nuts. And so we'd say, well, no, they're real people. You can investigate their credentials. And in one particular version of the video we did, we gave the attribution to one guy wrong in the video, and they found it. They said, ha, we found it. This guy does not exist. He is not someone that works in a university in Arizona. Ha, he's an actor. Well, actually, we had gotten his name wrong. we just had his name wrong, and so we had to change his name in the video because we just had his name wrong. But someone was actively checking to see whether or not we're making up these people. And this is the opposition that constantly swirls in the background that you don't actively see. And this is where we are more and more in our culture today when it comes to opposition to Christianity. First time in my lifetime it's been as bad as I've seen it, and it's growing worse pretty quickly. You've probably seen stuff I've seen as well, but it's tough. There really is the going sentiment today is that if you hold a certain religious view, you're only using that religious view as a smokescreen so that you can be prejudiced against a certain bunch of people. Now, we used to see this when we lived in Spokane up in North Idaho. There were these neo-Nazis that lived up there, and they actually proclaimed themselves to be a religious group so that they could hate people and hide behind their religious kind of aspersions. But that's not the case with us. But that's where culture's going. They're going to look at Christians, they actually do growingly, and come out and say, you only hold your religious views so that you can kind of legitimize your desire to be a bigot against certain groups of people. And bigotry and prejudice and discrimination is basically the highest ethic in our culture. So if it looks like you are discriminating, I mean, you're saying things that are ethical or not ethical in the culture, that you're actually being a bigot, rather than saying, no, I think this is not good for us. I mean, for instance, the threshold right now, no one could get away with saying that, sex with a child is a good thing. And across the culture, we would condemn that. But what if the culture shifts and says, well, I don't think it's so bad. But we still hold that view that, no, that's bad. That's a bad thing. Well, then you will eventually be opposed because you're using your religion to justify your discrimination against people who want to be with children. And that's kind of what's going on across the culture. This will get worse and worse and worse and worse. So opposition is something you need to get used to, like Paul's telling Timothy. Just realize in the confrontations, in the opposition, you don't have a spirit of fear, you have a spirit of power and of love and of a soundness in your thinking. That's really important. And it's unnatural. It's the Spirit. It's not you. Appeal to the Spirit to work through you and to speak through you for the good of the people who are opposing you. It's a big, big deal. Big, big deal. Okay, God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control, or a sound mind. One of those. Self-control I don't think is as good a translation as sound mind. Power and love and soundness is what I think of when I think of that. So anyway, I'm going to quit, but there's a rest of the story on the Jews for Jesus story. Did you suspect? Let's see where I pick it up here. Oh, okay. As we prepared to leave South Africa, a woman asked me about what had just happened, and I mumbled a brief explanation, at which point she informed me that she was a reporter for Reuters. She had come to the area for a different event, but she was quite interested in our story and asked if I would care to give an interview. So I did. And the next day, Jews for Jesus was front page news all throughout South Africa. As a result, a pastor invited us to give a concert at his rather large church, which happened to be in a very Jewish part of town. Another university invited us to give a concert on their campus. There, a Jewish student named Alice prayed with us after the concert and has been following Jesus ever since. After a few days of amazing opportunities for ministry, we boarded our flight to Australia. The airline staff had seen the stories in the press, and as a result, chose to bump us all up to first class for the long flight to Perth. Wow, just imagine how my team and I felt now. So time and again, he goes on, time and again, I have seen God use opposition as an opportunity to glorify himself and to expand the reach of our gospel message. No one enjoys opposition, but God promises us the grace to endure it And he often has a plan to use unpleasant situations for far greater things than we had ever had in mind. So this will continue for us, which makes 2 Timothy especially valuable. And we'll come back to it over and over again as the culture shifts and drifts, and as we stay anchored biblically into what God says is life and not life. So we stay anchored in that, and opposition grows and confrontations grow. How do you handle that stuff? Well, Paul has lived an entire lifetime of handling that stuff. So in this last letter, his Pros Timotheon Omega, he's going to tell Timothy how you conduct yourself in that kind of a culture. And that's why we need it. Okay, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the promise that this book brings. We look forward to your Spirit teaching us more and more how we can be effective lights in this ever-darkening culture that we live in. And Lord, it breaks our hearts to see those who are either our friends or our family or our acquaintances or our co-workers making such poor choices in terms of how to live life, what to do with our lives, to disregard you altogether, to take your offer of life and to basically sidestep it and disbelieve it. So Father, we pray that you would use us as powerful lights in this dark place, that you would remind us that the Spirit you gave us is not one of fear. It's not one of fear. It's a spirit of power and a spirit of love, a spirit of soundness. And pray that you would use your Spirit in and through us to draw many to yourself and to rescue those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. So thank you for putting us in a needy place. We do not enjoy opposition, but Lord, we know that you use it and you leverage it for great things in your kingdom and for the benefit of those who oppose. So thank you for this good word in Jesus' name. Amen.